A sudden knock at the door was the absolute last thing I expected, especially with the ridge winds biting hard enough to signal an early winter. In this isolated stretch of Wyoming country, visitors usually brought either trouble or a dead body. Swinging the door open, I found my closest neighbor, Lila Bennett, a relative term given she lived 5 miles down the valley. Shivering from the cold, she stood there clutching her father's rifle and staring a hole straight through my chest. "Wyatt," she said, "I need a husband by Friday." I was up to my elbows in a mule deer when the dog started barking. It was late October. The sky over the high country was the color of old iron, heavy and bruised, promising a snowfall that would not melt until May. I had the buck strung up by its hind legs from the heavy oak beam over the porch. The blood was warm on my hands, steaming in the frigid air, as I worked the skinning knife down the belly. When the hound set to howling, I did not reach for my rifle right away. It was a rhythmic, steady bark. Someone was coming up the trail, and they were not trying to hide it. I wiped my blade on my canvas trousers and waited. Out of the tree line rode Lila Bennett. Her horse, a big, rangy bay, was blowing hard, its chest coated in a thick, frothy lather. The trail up to my cabin was a steep, jagged climb of loose rock and mud, and she had pushed the beast too fast. Lila did not look much better. She wore a heavy wool coat that had belonged to her father. The sleeves rolled up twice to free her hands. Her hair, usually pinned back in a neat, tight braid, was loose and wild, plastered to her cheek by the freezing damp. Her face was pale and tight around the mouth, but it was her eyes that made me stop wiping the blood from my knuckles. They were completely hollowed out. She slid out of the saddle before the bay even came to a full stop. Her boots hit the mud with a heavy, wet sound. She did not tie the horse off. She just walked straight toward the porch, her knuckles white around the stock of a Winchester repeater. "Wyatt," she said. Her voice was flat, scraped clean of anything soft. "Lila, you're 5 miles off your property line, and that horse looks like it's about to drop. I need a husband by Friday." I just looked at her. The wind kicked up, rattling the tin roof of the cabin, carrying the scent of pine needles and copper from the hanging deer. I waited for a punchline. I waited for her to crack a smile or collapse or tell me it was some sort of fever dream. She did not do any of those things. She just stood there in the mud, shivering so hard the barrel of the Winchester was shaking. "I don't have time for you to stare at me," she said, her teeth beginning to chatter. "Are you going to answer?" "I'm going to tell you to come inside before you catch your death," I said. I turned around, grabbed a clean rag from the rail, and wiped the worst of the blood and grease from my hands. "Get in the cabin." She hesitated. Lila and I were neighbors, but we were not friends. I traded venison for her father's flour and coffee a few times a year. I helped them pull a mired calf out of the mud 2 springs ago. That was the extent of our socializing. I stayed on my mountain. They stayed in their valley. I walked past her, took the bay by the bridle, and led him toward the lean-to to throw a blanket over his shivering back. When I turned around, Lila was still standing in the yard. "Cabin," now I said. She marched up the steps and pushed through the heavy wooden door. I followed her in, securing the latch against the wind. The inside of the cabin was dim, lit only by the low embers in the stone hearth. It smelled like wood smoke, old leather and dried sage. I walked over to the fire, tossed a split log onto the coals, and watched the flames grab hold of the dry bark. Lila had not moved from the center of the room. She was holding the rifle across her chest like a shield. Water dripped from the hem of her coat, pooling on the floorboards. "Where's Samuel?" I asked. Her father rarely let her ride the high trails alone. "I buried him yesterday." The words hung in the quiet room. I turned away from the fire and looked at her. Samuel Bennett was a hard man, a fair man. He had survived 3 decades in a territory that actively tried to kill you every day. 3 years ago, when a late blizzard caught me tracking a wounded elk, Samuel had found me half dead in a snowdrift. He dragged me back to his homestead and poured hot broth down my throat until I stopped shaking. I owed him my fingers, my toes, and probably my life. How, I asked. A horse kicked him in the chest, shattered his ribs. He lingered for 2 days, and then he drowned in his own blood. She said it clinically. She had cried all she was going to cry. Now she was just surviving. I'm sorry, Lila. I don't need your sorrow, Wyatt. I need a husband. I pulled a tin cup from the shelf, filled it with black coffee from the pot resting on the edge of the hearth, and held it out to her. Put the gun down and take the cup. She stared at the coffee for a second, then leaned the Winchester against the heavy oak table. She took the cup with both hands, letting the heat seep into her frozen skin. Start talking, I said, and it better make sense. She took a long pull of the bitter coffee. It was a day old and tasted like ash, but she did not flinch. It's Cyrus Holt, she said. The name left a sour taste in my mouth, worse than the coffee. Holt owned the bank in town. He owned the saloon, the general store, and the sheriff. For the last 5 years, he had been buying up every failing ranch in the basin, squeezing the desperate and starving out the stubborn. He wanted the valley, and the Bennett Ranch sat right in the throat of it, controlling the only reliable deep-water creek that did not freeze solid in January. What does Holt have to do with you needing a ring? I asked, leaning against the stone mantel. My father took a loan from him 3 years ago to rebuild the barn after the fire, she said, staring down into the dark liquid in her cup. He signed the deed as collateral. It was a standard note, but Holt put a clause in it, a head of household clause. I narrowed my eyes, meaning the deed is only valid if held by a male head of household. If the debtor dies, the property transfers to the surviving male heir. If there is no male heir, the debt comes due immediately in full. If it can't be paid, the property defaults to the bank. That's not legal. Out here, it is. If Holt's judge says it is, she snapped, looking up at me. The loan balance is $400. I have $30. Holt's men rode out to the property this morning while I was filling in my father's grave. They told me I had until Friday noon to vacate the premises. Or what? Or Sheriff Brody comes and physically removes me, and Holt takes the ranch, the cattle, the creek, everything my father bled for. She gripped the tin cup so hard her knuckles popped. But there's a loophole. I read the contract. The exact wording says surviving male heir or legal proxy of the estate. A husband. If I am married by the time the foreclosure is filed on Friday, the debt remains a term loan and my husband assumes the deed. Holt can't take it. I ran a hand over my jaw. The stubble was rough, and underneath it, the old scars from a bear encounter ached with the cold. I looked around my cabin. It was small, quiet a place, built for one man who wanted nothing to do with the noise of the world. Why me? Lila, I asked quietly. There's a dozen men in town who would jump at the chance to marry Samuel Bennett's daughter and get their hands on that land. Exactly, she said. They want the land, or they want a maid, or they want to put a ring on me and treat me like livestock. I marry one of those men, I lose the ranch anyway. It just belongs to them instead of Holt. You don't want the land. You hate town. You barely come off this mountain, and she paused her voice, catching just a fraction before she forced it back to iron. You don't want me. I did not answer. I know you owe my father, Wyatt, she said, stepping closer. I know he pulled you out of the snow. I'm calling in the debt. Marriage isn't a debt repayment. It's a life sentence. It's paper, she countered fiercely. It's a signature in a registry book in Cedar Ridge, that's all. As soon as Holt is forced to back down and the note is restructured, we file an annulment. We tear up the paper. You come back to your mountain, and I keep my home. You'll never have to see me again. I stared at her. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the exhaustion bruising the skin under her eyes. She was 23. She should have been mourning her father. Instead, she was out here in the freezing mud, bargaining her freedom just to keep a roof over her head. Holt isn't going to just nod and walk away, I warned her. He finds out you're pulling a trick like this, he'll send men. Men like Vance. I know the risks. Do you? Vance would just as soon put a bullet in my back and make you a widow before the ink dries. Then shoot him first, she said. The absolute lack of hesitation in her voice surprised me. There was steel in Samuel Bennett's daughter. I looked back at the fire. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her to pack her bags, take her $30, and ride east. The frontier was no place for a woman alone, and picking a fight with Cyrus Holt was a fool's errand. I had left the violence of the world behind me a long time ago. I came to this mountain to be forgotten. But I looked at the Winchester leaning against my table. I remembered the burning cold of the snowdrift, the feeling of my lungs shutting down, and the rough, heavy hands of Samuel Bennett pulling me out of the dark. I set my jaw. "Drink your coffee," I said. "There's leftover stew in the iron pot. Eat it. You can sleep in the bed. I'll take the floor." Lila let out a breath she looked like she'd been holding all day. Her shoulders slumped just a fraction. "You'll do it. We ride for Cedar Ridge at first light," I said, walking toward the door to finish dealing with the deer. "Try not to snore. I'm a light sleeper." Thursday morning broke like a cracked pane of glass, pale, sharp, and brutally cold. We left the cabin before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. I'd thrown a saddle on my heavy draft cross, a big, ugly brute I called Deacon, and loaded my saddlebags with whatever ammunition I had in the lockbox. I wore my heavy buffalo coat, and on my right hip a Colt single-action Army revolver that hadn't been fired in anger in 4 years. I also strapped a heavy hunting knife to my belt. If we were going into Cedar Ridge to poke Cyrus Holt in the eye, I wasn't going in naked. Lila rode beside me on her bay. She looked better after a night of sleep and a hot meal, but the tension radiating off her was palpable. We didn't talk much. The horse's hooves crunched rhythmically through the crust of frost on the trail. The silence of the mountains slowly gave way as we descended. By mid-morning, the pristine white snow turned to gray slush. By noon, we hit the valley floor, and the slush turned into a thick, sucking brown mud. Cedar Ridge was an ugly scar of a town. It was built fast during a brief silver boom and never bothered to tear itself down when the silver dried up. Now it survived on cattle timber and vice. As we rode down the main thoroughfare, the smell of cheap coal smoke, wet horse manure, and stale beer hit me like a physical weight. I hated this place. People stared. They knew Lila, and they knew her father had just died. They also knew me by reputation, the hermit from the high ridge who only came down to buy salt and bullets. Seeing us riding side by side drew eyes from the saloon porches and the boardwalks. "Keep your head up," I told her quietly, not looking over. "Don't look at them. Look at the courthouse." "I'm fine," she said, her voice tight. We hitched the horses outside the municipal building. It was a 2-story brick structure that housed the sheriff's office on the bottom and the magistrate and records clerk on the top. Our boots thumped heavily on the wooden stairs. Inside, the clerk's office was stiflingly hot, heated by a pot-belly stove in the corner. The clerk, a thin, sweaty man named Higgins, was sorting through a stack of lands deeds. He looked up, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Miss Bennett," he said, feigning sympathy. "Terrible news about your father. Terrible. Sheriff Brody is actually out at the property now, or heading there shortly, to ensure the transition is smooth." "The transition is canceled, Mr. Higgins," Lila said, walking right up to the counter. "I need a marriage license, now." Higgins blinked. He looked from Lila to me. He swallowed hard. A marriage license. Miss Bennett, surely you aren't... Do I need to repeat myself?" "Well, no, but Judge Barker isn't in today," Higgins stammered, shuffling his papers. "He's in Cheyenne until Monday. I can't solemnize a marriage without the magistrate." You don't need to solemnize it to issue the license and record the intent, I said, stepping up beside Lila. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I just leaned my forearms on the counter and let my size do the talking. I was a head taller than Higgins and twice as wide. You issue the license. It becomes a matter of public record that legally satisfies the proxy clause in a standard banknote. Higgins began to sweat in earnest. Now, see here, Mr. Kane. Mr. Holt has very specific instructions regarding the Bennett estate. Mr. Holt isn't the law, I said softly. You are an employee of the territory. Issue the paper, Higgins, or I'm going to come back there and help you find it. Higgins looked at the heavy knife on my belt. His hands trembled as he opened a large leather-bound ledger. He dipped a pen in the inkwell. Names, he muttered. Lila Rose Bennett, she said firmly. Wyatt James Kane. He wrote them down. He filled out a certificate, stamped it with the territorial seal, and pushed it across the counter. Lila grabbed it like it was a lifeline. 50 cents, Higgins squeaked. I tossed a silver coin onto the wood. We turned and walked out of the office. We had done it. Step 1 was complete. But as we stepped out onto the second-floor landing and started down the exterior wooden stairs, a voice stopped us cold. Well now, ain't this a touching scene? Standing at the bottom of the stairs, blocking our path to the street, was a man in a tailored woolen suit and a bowler hat. His boots were polished, contrasting sharply with the mud around him. He had a gold chain hanging from his vest and a smile that didn't reach his dead, flat eyes. Behind him stood 3 men, rough men. Dusters covered their holstered weapons, but their hands rested close to their belts. The man in the bowler hat struck a match on the wooden railing and lit a cigarillo. Vance Lila whispered, freezing beside me. Cyrus Holt's right-hand man. The enforcer. Miss Bennett Vance drawled, exhaling a plume of blue smoke. I was real sorry to hear about your daddy. Tragic. And so soon after I see you found yourself a replacement. He looked me up and down, his lip curling in disgust. You smell like a slaughterhouse mountain man, and you smell like Holt's lapdog, I said, my voice carrying over the muddy street. Step aside, Vance. Vance chuckled a dry, rattling sound. You think a piece of paper from a terrified clerk changes anything? That ranch belongs to Mr. Holt. The bank takes possession tomorrow at noon. Not anymore, Lila said, holding up the folded license. I am legally betrothed. The estate transitions to Wyatt. The debt remains a term loan. We'll make the next payment on the 1st of the month. Vance's smile vanished. The dead eyes went colder. Mr. Holt don't like clever girls, Lila, and he sure as hell don't like poachers on his claim. He gave a slight nod. The 3 men behind him fanned out slightly, adjusting their coats. The street around us suddenly went quiet. The few pedestrians on the boardwalk ducked into stores or scurried into alleys. The silence of an impending gunfight is a heavy, suffocating thing. I didn't move my hand toward my Colt. Not yet. Drawing a gun meant someone was going to die, and a dead man on the street meant Sheriff Brody would lock us both up. If we were in jail tomorrow at noon, Holt would take the ranch anyway. I stepped down 1 stair. Just one. I put myself between Lila and the men below. You want to draw on me, Vance? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Go ahead. You might get me. Your boys might get me. But I promise you, before I hit the mud, I'll put a bullet right through your left eye. Vance stared at me. He was trying to read my bluff. I wasn't bluffing. I had lived in the high country too long to fear a man in a bowler hat. I locked eyes with him, letting him see the utter lack of hesitation in me. For 10 long seconds, nobody breathed. Then Vance took a slow drag of his cigarillo and stepped back, clearing the bottom of the stairs. You got a lot of nerve, mountain man, Vance said softly. But you can't stay awake forever. And it's a long, dark ride back to the Bennett place. We'll manage, I said. I reached back, grabbed Lila's arm, and guided her down the stairs past them. I kept my body angled, watching Vance and his men until we were mounted on our horses. As we rode out of Cedar Ridge, the sun dipped behind the clouds, casting a gray pall over the valley. We had the paper. We had the legal right. But as I looked at the dark tree line ahead of us, I knew Vance was right. It was going to be a long, dark ride, and Friday noon was still a lifetime away. The light died fast in the valley. By the time we put 3 miles between us and Cedar Ridge, the sky was a bruised purple fading into dead black. The mud froze as the temperature plummeted, turning the trail into a jagged, ankle-breaking rut. Deacon didn't mind. He was a mountain horse, built for misery. Lila's bay was struggling, its breathing ragged and wet in the bitter air. "We need to get off the main trail," I said, keeping my voice low. The wind had died down, and sound traveled for miles in the freezing stillness. Lila pulled her horse up beside mine. Her face was a pale blur in the dark. "If we cut through the timber, it adds 2 hours. My horse is failing Wyatt. If we stay on the road, we don't make it at all." I didn't wait for her to argue. I reined Deacon hard to the left, pushing him off the beaten path and into the dense stand of lodgepole pines. She followed. I knew the topography. Before I retreated to my cabin, I had hunted every ridge and draw in this basin. 2 miles east, the timber broke at Bennett Creek, the same water source Cyrus Holt was ready to kill for. If we crossed there, we could slip through the back pasture of her father's property unseen. The woods were pitch black. Pine branches whipped at our coats, and the horses navigated by instinct. I kept my hand resting on the smooth wood of the Winchester protruding from my saddle scabbard. My thumb traced the hammer. Vance wouldn't wait for Friday noon. He was a predator, and predators hunt in the dark. If we didn't show up at the ranch to claim the deed Holt won legally, a couple of bodies dumped in a ravine made the paperwork much cleaner. We heard the water before we saw it. The creek was running fast and loud, swollen from the early snowmelt higher up the ridge. We broke through the tree line. The moon had finally crested the eastern peaks, casting a cold silver light across the rushing water. The crossing was narrow, flanked by steep cutbanks of frozen mud. "Let them drink, then we push across fast," I whispered. Lila nodded, sliding out of the saddle to loosen the cinch. I stayed mounted, my eyes scanning the opposite bank. The shadows under the trees looked too thick, too still. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't a sound. It was an absence of it. The frogs and nightbirds were dead quiet. "Lila, get back on the horse." She didn't ask questions. She saw my posture and grabbed the horn, pulling herself up. A rifle cracked. The sound tore through the quiet like a canvas sail ripping in a gale. The heavy bullet missed me, punching a fist-sized hole through the trunk of a dead cottonwood a foot to my left. Splinters showered my shoulder. I roared, yanking my Winchester free. 2 more muzzle flashes bloomed from the opposite bank. The crack of the rifles echoed off the canyon walls. Lila spurred the bay, but the exhausted animal stumbled in the freezing mud of the shallows. Another shot rang out. The bay let out a high, terrible shriek. It buckled at the knees, pitching forward into the rushing water. Lila was thrown clear, hitting the icy creek with a heavy splash. I hauled back on Deacon's reins, turning him broadside to the gunfire. I threw the Winchester to my shoulder, didn't bother with the sights, and fired twice at the muzzle flashes in the tree line. A man yelled a curse, loud and panicked. I spurred Deacon into the water. The big horse hit the creek like a boulder, water spraying over my thighs. I reached down, grabbing the collar of Lila's wool coat just as she fought her way to her knees. She was soaking wet, gasping for air. "Up," I yelled, pulling with my left arm, while laying down covering fire with my right. She scrambled up Deacon's wet flank, hauling herself behind the saddle, her arms locked around my waist like iron bands. The shooters were reloading. I could hear the metallic clack of a lever action across the creek. Hold on. I drove my spurs into Deacon. He lunged up the opposite bank, his iron-shod hooves tearing great chunks of frozen earth loose. A bullet snapped past my ear, close enough that I felt the displacement of air. We didn't stop. We crested the bank and plunged into the thick timber on the Bennett side of the property. I kept Deacon at a hard gallop, ducking low over his neck as branches tore at my hat and coat. Lila clung to me, shivering violently against my back, her wet clothes freezing solid in the wind. We rode for 20 minutes before I finally pulled back on the reins, letting the lathered horse drop to a walk. We were deep in the back pasture. The lights of the Bennett homestead were a mile away. I looked back. No pursuit. Vance's men had lost us in the timber, or they were busy pulling their wounded man out of the brush. My horse Lila whispered. Her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely form the words. They killed my horse. I'm sorry, Lila. She didn't cry. She just tightened her grip around my waist. The freezing water was seeping through my coat, chilling me to the bone. We're almost home, I said. The Bennett ranch house sat in a slight depression in the valley floor, shielded from the worst of the northern winds by a stand of ancient oaks. It was a solid, practical structure of milled lumber and fieldstone. No lights burned in the windows. To the right, a fresh mound of earth sat near the edge of the family plot. Samuel. We rode into the barn. It smelled of dry hay manure and old leather. I slid off Deacon and immediately helped Lila down. Her legs gave out the second her boots hit the dirt floor. She was hypothermic, her lips tinged blue, her whole body shaking in violent, uncontrollable spasms. Come on, I said, hooking an arm under hers and lifting her. We need a fire. I half-carried her across the dark yard and up the porch steps. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers numb and useless, until I took the keys and forced the door open. The inside of the house was freezing, colder than the outside air because it held the dampness. I sat her in a heavy wooden rocking chair by the hearth. Stripped the wet clothes I ordered, turning my back to her. I went to work on the fire. Samuel always kept a stack of dry kindling and split cedar logs by the mantel. I struck a match, my own hands stiff and clumsy, and coaxed a small flame into the dry moss. Within minutes, a fire was roaring up the chimney, throwing heat and orange light across the room. I stood up and turned around. Lila had stripped off the soaking wool coat and her ruined blouse. She was wrapped in a heavy quilt she had pulled from a trunk, huddled close to the flames. She wasn't shaking as badly, but her eyes were vacant, staring at the empty chair across the room. Her father's chair. I went to the kitchen, found a bottle of cheap rye whiskey in a cupboard, and poured 2 fingers into a glass. I brought it to her. Drink, I said. She took it, her hand trembling, and swallowed it like medicine. She coughed as it hit her stomach, closing her eyes. Thank you, she rasped. I nodded. I walked to the windows, pulling the heavy wooden shutters closed, and dropping the iron bars into place. I did the same to the front and back doors. We were sealed in. I took off my buffalo coat. The left sleeve of my flannel shirt was heavy and wet. I hadn't noticed it during the ride, but the adrenaline was wearing off, and a deep, burning ache was settling into my shoulder. Lila noticed. The haze cleared from her eyes. You're bleeding. Wood splinter, I said, inspecting the tear in the fabric. When they shot the tree, it went through the meat of the shoulder. Not a bullet. She pushed the quilt off her shoulders, standing up. Underneath, she wore a simple cotton undershirt and her trousers. She walked to the wash basin, poured water from a pitcher, and grabbed a clean towel. Sit, she said, pointing to a stool by the fire. I can manage, Lila. Sit down, Wyatt. I sat. She stepped close, her hands still cold as she unbuttoned the top of my shirt and pulled the fabric back. The splinter was the size of an iron nail, jagged and buried deep in the muscle near my collarbone. Blood was steadily trickling down my chest. This is going to hurt, she said. "Just pull it." She gripped the protruding end of the wood. She didn't hesitate or count to 3. She just pulled. A sharp hiss escaped my teeth. The heat flared in my shoulder, and a fresh wave of warm blood followed the wood out. Lila pressed the towel firmly against the wound, applying heavy pressure. She stood there, leaning her weight into my shoulder. Her breathing was steadying. I looked at her face in the firelight. There were dark circles under her eyes, and a smear of dried mud across her cheek. She was beautiful, not in the soft porcelain way the girls in town were, but in a hard, enduring way, like a piece of flint. "They were waiting at the creek," she said quietly, staring at the bloody towel. "Vance must have sent them ahead while we were leaving town." "They'll be back," I said. "When those 2 report in and tell Vance we made it across, Holt will bring the law. He'll want it to look legal when he takes this place. Tomorrow is Friday." "Yes." She let up on the pressure. The bleeding had slowed to a crawl. She went to a cabinet, retrieved a small tin of salt and some clean bandages, and began dressing the wound. Her hands were gentle now, methodical. "My father liked you," she said out of nowhere. "He saved my life. He said you were a man who understood the cost of things." She continued tying off the bandage. "He said most men out here are just looking to take. You just wanted to be left alone." "The world rarely leaves you alone, Lila." "I know." She stepped back, looking around the room. The firelight danced over the simple furniture, the braided rugs, the rifle mounted over the door. "I was born in that room down the hall. My mother died in it." "My father." She stopped her throat working as she swallowed hard. "I'm not letting Holt put a bank manager in this house. I'll burn it to the foundation first." "You won't have to." I stood up, testing the shoulder. It was stiff, but the muscle worked. I walked over to the table and picked up my Winchester, checking the action and sliding fresh rounds through the loading gate. "You should sleep," I told her. "I'll keep watch. They won't hit us tonight." Vance's boy's got a bloody nose, and it's too dark to coordinate an assault. But tomorrow morning, we're going to have company. She didn't argue. She pulled the quilt back around her shoulders and walked toward the bedroom. At the doorway, she stopped and looked back at me. "Wyatt." "Yeah, we're legally married now, aren't we?" As soon as Higgins stamped that paper. "By the letter of the territory law, yes. She looked down at the floorboards, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't want to die a widow tomorrow." "You aren't going to die tomorrow," I said. I met her eyes, making sure she heard the absolute certainty in my voice. "And neither am I. Get some sleep." Friday morning arrived, pale and suffocating. A thick gray fog had rolled down from the high country during the night, settling over the valley floor like a dirty wool blanket. You couldn't see the barn from the porch. I was sitting in Samuel Bennett's rocking chair, a cup of bitter black coffee in one hand, my Colt resting on my thigh. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. Lila emerged from the bedroom just as the gray light began bleeding through the cracks in the shutters. She wore clean clothes, heavy canvas trousers, riding boots, and her father's old canvas duster. She had pulled her hair back into a tight braid. She looked like she was going to war. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood by the hearth. "What time is it?" she asked. I checked the pocket watch I kept in my vest. 8 o'clock. We have 4 hours until the deadline. Will they wait? "No," I said, standing up. "Holt wants us out before noon so he can ride back to town and file the default with the magistrate. They'll be here soon." I unbarred the heavy wooden shutters on the front window, cracking one open just enough to see the yard. The fog was dense, swirling in slow, lazy circles. We waited. The silence stretched for an hour. The tension in the room was a living thing, tightening around our chests. Lila sat at the table methodically cleaning and oiling her father's spare revolver, a heavy Smith & Wesson. At 9:30, the dogs under the porch started growling. It was a low, vibrating sound that rattled the floorboards. "Here we go," I said softly. I pushed the shutter open a few more inches. Out of the fog, shapes began to materialize. First, the horses, their breath pluming white in the cold air. Then, the men. There were 6 of them. Leading the pack was Sheriff Brody. He rode a gray mare and wore a heavy buffalo coat with a tarnished tin star pinned to the lapel. Brody was a politician with a badge, a man who survived by knowing exactly whose boots to lick. Right now, his tongue was firmly planted on Cyrus Holt's leather. Next to him was Holt himself. I had only seen the banker a few times from a distance. Up close, he was a small, fastidious man in a dark suit and a bowler hat, looking entirely out of place in the Wyoming mud. He sat on a beautiful, expensive black thoroughbred that hated the cold. Behind them, flanking the rear, was Vance and 3 of his hired guns, the men from the creek. They stopped 20 yards from the porch. "Lila Bennett," Sheriff Brody shouted, his voice muffled by the heavy fog. "This is the county sheriff. Step out onto the porch." I looked at Lila. She had the Smith & Wesson gripped tight in her right hand. "Leave the gun," I told her. "We go out together. We play the paper first." She hesitated, then set the heavy revolver on the table. She reached into her duster pocket and pulled out the folded marriage license. I unbarred the front door and pulled it open. The freezing air hit us instantly. We stepped out onto the porch side by side. I kept my hands away from my belt, but my coat was open, the handle of my Colt clearly visible. I stood slightly in front of her. Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle when he saw me. "Kane, what the hell are you doing down off your mountain?" "I live here now, Sheriff," I said, my voice carrying flat across the yard. Cyrus Holt leaned forward over his saddle horn. His eyes were small, dark, and predatory. He looked at Lila with a mixture of pity and utter contempt. Miss Bennett Holt said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I am deeply sorry for your loss. Samuel was a respected man. But business is business. Your deadline is approaching. The bank is taking possession of the property." "Have you packed your things?" "I'm not leaving, Mr. Holt," Lila said, stepping up beside me. "Now, Lila, let's not make this difficult," Brody said, holding up a hand. "The law is clear. The deed reverts to the bank upon the death of the head of household if there's no male heir to assume the debt. I don't want to use force to remove you." "There is no default," Lila said loudly. "Read the contract, Sheriff. It says surviving male heir or legal proxy. A husband." She stepped forward to the edge of the porch and held up the piece of paper. "Wyatt Kane and I were legally wed yesterday in Cedar Ridge. Mr. Higgins issued the license and recorded the intent. Wyatt assumes the deed. The debt remains a term loan. You have no legal right to this land." Silence fell over the yard. Sheriff Brody squinted at the paper. He looked at Holt. Holt's face didn't change, but his eyes narrowed to slits. He didn't look surprised. Vance had obviously told him about our trip to the courthouse. "A piece of paper," Holt mused, his voice dripping with condescension. "A piece of paper signed in a panic by a grieving daughter and a drifter. Do you take me for a fool, Miss Bennett? This is a sham, a desperate, fraudulent attempt to circumvent a legal contract." "It's a territorial document, Holt," I said, "signed, sealed, and binding. If you want to challenge it, take it up with a federal judge in Cheyenne. But right now, you are trespassing on my property." Vance walked his horse forward, breaking formation. He looked at me, a nasty, jagged smile splitting his face. "Your property? That's a good one, mountain man. You think a stamped piece of paper stops a bullet?" "Vance, throttle," Holt warned sharply. Holt didn't want a bloodbath with the sheriff standing right there. Not if he could help it. He was a man who preferred to steal with a pen, not a gun. Sheriff Holt said, turning to Brody, "I suspect fraud. The timing is entirely too convenient. I want this man removed from the premises so my bank can secure its assets." Brody swallowed hard. He looked at the marriage license in Lila's hand, then at the heavy Colt on my hip. He knew if he ordered his men forward, someone was going to die on this porch, and he wasn't entirely sure it wouldn't be him. Now Mr. Holt Brody stammered, "If they have the paper legally, my hands are tied until a judge rules it invalid. I can't just evict a married couple off their own deeded land without a court order. I am giving you the order." Brody Holt snapped his civilized veneer, cracking. "It's a federal matter now, Cyrus," I said. "You touch us, you touch her. You're not just foreclosing, you're committing murder and theft against a recognized homestead. The marshals out of Cheyenne will hang you, bank or no bank." Holt stared at me. He was calculating the odds, the cost. Then Vance did exactly what a rabid dog does. He slipped the leash. "I'm tired of talking to this piece of trash," Vance snarled. He didn't draw from his hip. He already had a short-barreled scattergun resting across his thighs under his heavy coat. He snapped the barrel up, aiming straight at the porch. I didn't think. I reacted. I threw my left arm out, shoving Lila hard backward through the open doorway. At the exact same moment, my right hand dropped to my hip, my thumb hooking the hammer of the Colt as I drew. The roar of the shotgun deafened me. A hail of buckshot shredded the wooden pillar of the porch a foot from my head, showering me in splinters. I fired blindly through the cloud of smoke and wood chips. The heavy .45 caliber round took Vance's horse in the chest. The animal screamed, rearing back violently. Vance was thrown from the saddle, his boots tangling in the stirrups as he hit the freezing mud. "Take cover!" Brody screamed, spurring his mare backward. The other 3 hired guns drew their irons. I dove sideways, rolling off the edge of the porch into the muddy flower bed as a volley of bullets tore through the front windows of the house, shattering glass and punching holes in the siding. The legal standoff was over. The siege had begun. The mud beneath the porch was frozen solid in some spots and an icy slurry in others. I hit it hard, rolling shoulder over shoulder, as the air above me turned into a hornet's nest of lead. The porch railing splintered, showering my back with jagged shards of painted wood. The roar of the gunfire was deafening, a localized thunderstorm trapped in the heavy morning fog. I scrambled behind the thick fieldstone foundation of the chimney, pressing my back against the freezing rock. I sucked in a harsh breath, wiping a smear of mud from my eyes. The ringing in my ears was a high, thin whine. But underneath it, I could hear the panicked shouting of men losing control of a situation. "Get him!" "Get the mountain man!" Vance bellowed. His voice was ragged. He was still pinned or tangled near his dead horse. "I can't see a damn thing," one of the hired guns yelled back. The fog was our only advantage. It had swallowed the yard, turning the gunmen into gray, shifting silhouettes. I thumbed back the hammer of the Colt. I had 5 rounds left in the cylinder. I took a breath, held it, and leaned out from the edge of the chimney. A rider was trying to flank the house to the west, his revolver flashing as he fired blindly at the shattered front window. He was a sitting duck in the saddle. I leveled the Colt tracked to the center of his heavy canvas duster and squeezed the trigger. The heavy recoil pushed back against my palm. The man jerked in the saddle, a sharp grunt escaping his lips. He dropped his gun, grabbed his chest, and slid sideways off his horse, hitting the ground with a wet, heavy thud. The riderless horse bolted into the gray mist. That left 2 guns on horseback, plus Vance on the ground, and Holt and Brody. "Hold your fire! Hold your goddamn fire!" Sheriff Brody screamed. He sounded terrified. "Holt, this is a massacre!" "I'm not dying for your bank." I heard the frantic sound of hooves churning the mud. Through a break in the fog, I saw Holt's expensive black thoroughbred wheel around. The banker wasn't a fighting man. The moment the paperwork failed and the leads started flying, his nerve broke. He spurred his horse hard, abandoning his men, fleeing back down the valley trail toward Cedar Ridge. Brody didn't hesitate. He spurred his gray mare and followed Holt into the mist, shouting for the deputies. "You cowards!" Vance roared from the mud. A shadow moved near the front steps. One of the remaining hired guns had dismounted and was creeping toward the porch, a repeating rifle raised to his shoulder. He was trying to get an angle on the front door. He was trying to get to Lila. I stepped out from behind the chimney, raising my Colt, but before I could align the sights, the booming crack of a heavy-caliber weapon erupted from inside the house. The front door kicked open a few inches. Through the gap, the barrel of Samuel Bennett's Smith & Wesson belched a cloud of white smoke. The rifleman on the steps stopped dead. He looked down at his stomach, a look of profound confusion washing over his face. His knees buckled, and he collapsed face first into the frozen hydrangeas lining the porch. "Lila back." Her voice rang out from the dark interior of the house, hard and absolute. "The next one goes through the door." The last mounted gunner had seen enough. Holt had run. The sheriff had run. Two of his partners were dead in the mud. He wheeled his horse sharply, putting the fog between himself and the house, and galloped off after the banker. Suddenly the yard was quiet. The gunfire faded, leaving only the sound of horses blowing hard and the wet, choking gasps of Vance struggling in the mud. I kept my gun raised, my eyes scanning the dense gray air for any trick, any movement. Nothing. Just the slow swirl of the mist. I moved cautiously along the edge of the house, my boots sinking into the ruined flower beds. I rounded the corner of the porch. Vance was sitting up in the muck. His right leg was trapped under the massive, lifeless bulk of his horse. His bowler hat was gone, his slicked hair plastered to his forehead with freezing mud and sweat. He was frantically trying to pull a small hideout revolver from an ankle holster with his left hand, his right arm hanging at an unnatural angle. I closed the distance in 3 long strides. Before his fingers could find the grip of the little gun, I kicked him squarely in the chest. Vance went sprawling backward into the mud, gasping for air. I stepped over his trapped leg, planting the heel of my boot heavily onto his left wrist, pinning it to the ground. I leveled the barrel of my Colt directly at his forehead. Vance looked up at me. The bravado was gone. The dead flat eyes were finally wide with a very real, very human terror. He looked at the black hole of the muzzle, then at the hammer pulled back under my thumb. "You're a dead man," Kane Vance spat, though his voice shook. "Holt won't stop. He owns the judge. He'll have you hanged for this." "Holt ran," I said softly, the adrenaline leaving my voice, cold and hollow. "He left you to die in the mud over a $400 loan." I stared down at him. My finger was tight on the trigger. It would be so easy. A 1/4 inch of pressure and the biggest threat to Lila's life would be gone forever. Out here, you didn't leave a rabid wolf alive to bite you the next night. But I heard the crunch of boots on the porch behind me. I didn't turn around, but I knew it was Lila. She was standing there holding her father's gun, looking out over the carnage in her front yard. The yard where she used to play. The yard where she had just buried her father. If I pulled the trigger now, it wasn't self-defense. It was an execution, and she would have to watch me do it. I slowly let the hammer down on the Colt. I leaned over, reached into his coat, and pulled the scattergun from the mud. I tossed it out of reach. Then I grabbed him by the collar of his tailored wool suit and hauled his face up toward mine. "You listen to me, Vance," I whispered, keeping my voice so low only he could hear it. "You ride back to Cedar Ridge. You tell Holt the mortgage is secure. You tell him if he sends another man to this property, if he even looks at this valley on a map, I won't wait on the porch. I will come to town. I will find him in his bed, and then I will find you." I shoved him back into the mud. I turned my back on him and walked toward the porch. I holstered my gun. I didn't look over my shoulder to see if he was pulling another hidden weapon. I just walked up the stairs, took Lila by the elbow, and led her back inside the ruined house. The inside of the cabin was a wreck. Bullets had chewed through the front walls, shattering plates in the cupboards, splintering the heavy oak table, and punching holes through the tin stovepipe. The wind howled through the broken window panes, carrying the metallic smell of blood and burnt black powder into the room. I pulled the heavy front door shut and dropped the wooden bar across it. Lila was standing by the hearth, staring at the Smith & Wesson in her hand. Her knuckles were white. She was shivering, but it wasn't from the cold. I walked over to her gently, put my hand over hers, and pushed the barrel of the revolver toward the floor. I pried the gun from her fingers and set it on the mantel. "It's over," I said. She looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown out. "I shot him." "You did." "I aimed at his chest, Wyatt. I didn't try to scare him, I tried to kill him. He was coming through that door to do worse to you," I said, my voice steady, grounding her. "You did what you had to do to survive. Never apologize for that. Never lose sleep over it." She nodded slowly, but the shock was setting in. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. I gripped her shoulders. Lila looked at me. She blinked, focusing on my face. "Are you hit?" I asked. "Check yourself. Any burning? Any wetness?" She shook her head, running her trembling hands down her sides over her heavy canvas trousers. "No, I'm okay. I'm not hurt." She looked at me, her eyes tracing the mud and splinters covering my coat. She saw the fresh blood seeping through the bandage on my shoulder, reopening the wound from the splinter the night before. "You're bleeding again," she said. "It's nothing. Just pulled the muscle." I walked over to the shattered window. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, burned away by a pale, weak sun. Vance had managed to drag himself out from under the dead horse. He was limping heavily, clutching his ruined wrist, making his way down the long driveway toward the valley road. He didn't look back. The two bodies remained in the mud, slowly freezing as the temperature held near zero. "I have to move them," I said quietly. "Can't leave them in the yard." "Leave them," Lila said. Her voice had found its iron again. "Let Sheriff Brody come back with a wagon and clean up Holt's mess." She walked into the kitchen, crunching over broken glass and shattered ceramic. She found the bottle of rye whiskey that had miraculously survived the crossfire on the counter. She grabbed two somewhat clean glasses, walked back into the living room, and poured a heavy measure into both. She handed me one. We didn't toast. We just drank. The whiskey burned a hot welcome trail down my throat, settling the lingering tremors of adrenaline in my gut. We spent the next 2 hours boarding up the broken windows. We dragged heavy wooden planks from the barn and nailed them over the shattered frames to keep the freezing wind out. We didn't talk much. The work was methodical, a necessary distraction from the bodies in the yard and the reality of how close we had come to dying. By 11 o'clock, the cabin was dark again, sealed against the cold, lit only by the roaring fire in the hearth. I sat heavily in the rocking chair, pulling off my muddy boots. My shoulder throbbed with a deep, sickening rhythm. My hands were bruised, the knuckles scraped raw from the fall off the porch. I was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that made me feel every one of my 36 years. Lila was sitting at the table, a wet rag in her hand, wiping the mud off her father's revolver. "It's almost noon," she said, looking at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. "Holt isn't coming back," I said, leaning my head against the back of the chair and closing my eyes. "Brody is a coward. He'll write a report saying there was a shootout over a disputed claim, but he won't arrest us. He knows Holt pushed an illegal eviction, and he knows Holt fled the scene of a gunfight. Brody wants to keep his badge. He'll sweep this under the rug. And the deed it holds. You have the marriage license. With Holt backing down, the bank has to recognize the proxy. You send them the $40 payment on the first of the month, and they have to accept it. The ranch is yours, Lila." Silence stretched across the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the clock. "We did it," she whispered. I opened my eyes and looked at her. She was staring at the flames. The harsh, desperate edge that had driven her up my mountain 2 days ago was gone. In its place was a quiet, heavy sorrow. She had saved her home, but she was entirely alone in it. "I'll pack my saddlebags," I said, my voice rough. "Deacon is rested enough in the barn. I'll ride out before the storm hits this evening. You should be safe now." Lila stopped wiping the gun. She set the rag down on the table. She didn't look at me. "You're leaving." That was the deal, Lila. A signature on a piece of paper, a fight with Holt, and then an annulment. I go back to my mountain. You keep your home. She stood up. She walked over to the hearth, her back to me, staring into the orange coals. "And if I don't want the annulment?" she asked. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 12. A deep, sonorous chime echoed through the battered cabin. 12 times. Friday noon. The deadline had passed. I sat completely still in the rocking chair. The pain in my shoulder faded into the background. I stared at Lila's back, trying to process what she had just said. "Lila," I started, my voice careful, like I was trying not to spook a wild horse. "You're in shock. You've buried your father. You nearly froze to death, and you just killed a man. You're holding on to the nearest solid thing, but you don't want me." She turned around. The firelight caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was looking at me with the same intense, unyielding stare she had used when she first stood in my doorway on the ridge. "Don't tell me what I want, Wyatt," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not a child, and I'm not in shock. I know exactly what I'm saying." "I'm a hermit," I said, pointing a thumb at my own chest. "I'm 13 years older than you. I don't like towns. I don't like people. I came to this territory to be left alone because everything I touch turns to blood and ash. Look around this room. Look what happened just because I rode down here." "Holt brought the blood," she countered fiercely, taking a step toward me. "Not you. You stood between me and a shotgun. You rode into the dark, knowing Vance was waiting. You bled on my floor to keep a roof over my head." She stopped standing just a few feet from my chair. "The men in this valley," she continued, her voice softening just a fraction. "They look at me and they see acreage. They see a deed. They see a woman they can command. When you look at me, you see a person. You saw a person when I was standing freezing in your yard. You handed me a gun, not a broom." I looked down at my hands. They were scarred, calloused, stained with dirt and old violence. They weren't hands built for holding on to anything soft. It's a harsh life down here, Lila. It's a fight every single day. "I know how to fight," she said. "I just don't want to fight alone anymore." I looked up at her. The cynicism that had protected me for the last decade, the thick, heavy armor I wore to keep the world out, felt suddenly thin and useless. I had convinced myself that isolation was peace, but sitting in this broken room, smelling gunpowder and cheap whiskey, looking at the woman who had just fought a war beside me, I realized peace was just another word for being dead while you were still breathing. "The annulment is easy," I warned her, giving her one last out. "We ride into Cedar Ridge next week. Sign a paper and it's done. No one judges you." Lila reached into her duster pocket. She pulled out the folded stamped marriage license, the 50-cent piece of paper that had caused all this death and destruction. She walked over to the hearth. She looked at the document for a long moment. Then, without a word, she tossed it directly into the roaring fire. I watched the edges of the heavy parchment curl, turn brown, and burst into bright orange flame. The territorial seal melted into ash. Within seconds, the legal proof of our sham marriage was gone, drawn up the chimney as gray smoke. "What did you just do?" I asked, my heart hammering a strange, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Lila turned to look at me, a faint, genuine smile finally touching the corners of her mouth. I don't need a piece of paper to tell Holt this is my land, she said. And I don't need a piece of paper to tell me who my husband is. She walked over to the rocking chair. She reached down, took my rough, battered hands in hers, and pulled me to my feet. She didn't flinch at the dirt or the blood. You owe my father, she whispered, stepping into my space, her eyes locked on mine. He saved your life. Now you owe me a lifetime. I looked at the fierce, beautiful woman standing in front of me. I thought of my quiet, empty cabin on the ridge, the freezing winds, the profound, suffocating silence. I took a deep breath, letting the smell of the smoke and the whiskey settle into my lungs. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her close. She rested her head against my chest, right over my heart. All right, Lila, I muttered into her hair. The debt is paid. Outside, the wind began to howl again, whistling through the cracks in the boards, carrying the promise of a long, brutal winter. The dead men lay in the mud. The bank would regroup. The world would keep trying to tear us down. But as I held her in the dim light of the ruined cabin, I knew one thing for certain. Let them come.